Good morning, everyone. We're glad to have you on here. We've got a pretty big group, and so there's a lot of interest in this. Just before we get started, and I turn it over to Robin, just a couple of things. We have the audio muted. We'd ask that you go ahead and put your questions in the chat, which is down at the bottom of the screen in the center there. And then leave your video unmute or leave your video muted, please. We'll just have Robin and the folks from FSA who are doing that. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Robin Reid, and she will go through some of this along with the folks that we have from the Kansas Farm Service Agency office here in Manhattan. Robin, go ahead.
All right. Thank you, Rich. And thanks for being on this morning. Again, I'm Robin Reid, Extension Farm Economist with Kansas State University, Agricultural Economics. Also on today is David Schemm, our State Executive Director of the Farm Service Agency, and Todd Barrows and Carla Wikoff, who are Agricultural Program Specialists with the Farm Service Agency. So before I dive into all the specifics of these direct payments, just recognize this information came out on Tuesday of this week. FSA had their training on it yesterday, and their offices are opening next week, Tuesday, to start taking signups. So this is a very quick moving program, and we're going to try to have all the answers for your questions here today. But just know there is some clarification that we're still waiting on with some of the issues. And I will get into that as we go along. Again, please keep your microphone muted and your video off. And if you have questions, go ahead and type them in the chat. I see some have came in already. And I just asked, I'm going to go through a lot of that information. So maybe if you wait to the end with some of those questions, I'll probably answer them within the presentation. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. So some of the confusion around these direct payments is this is actually payments from two programs that are being rolled into one payment. So the CARES Act, which got signed in April, allocated $9.5 billion in direct payments to agriculture producers. That is being combined with $6.5 billion from the CCC Charter Act, that's Commodity Credit Corporation, same place that your MFP payments have been coming from in the last couple of years. So this act actually goes back to 1948, but the CARES Act replenished some of those funds for the CCC. There were some that will not be available till later this year. So long story short, these two acts were combined for a total of $16 billion in direct payments made to producers. Now, as I go through, you're going to see different payment rates for the two different funding sources. So the CARES Act is to really compensate all losses that occurred from mid-January to mid-April. And then the CCC portion is to help with the ongoing market disruptions and things that are affecting our agriculture markets because of the pandemic. So the timing of these payments, I know some of you probably know this already, but I want to make sure I go through everything here. At this point, your calculated payment will only be 80%. And that is because I think we had some issues there when the PPP program ran out of money, and we don't want to see this in this program too. We want to make sure all farmers and producers that are eligible get their payment. So at this time, they're holding back 20% of that calculated payment, which will be made at a later time by the discretion of the Secretary if that $16 billion does not run out. So just know what I'm going to be talking about here. Your payment will be reduced by 80% here initially to make sure the funds do not run out. So sign up again starts next week, Tuesday, and then runs through August 28th. So obviously there's a lot of time to get in and get enrolled for these direct payments. Now I'm just going to walk through one at a time the different categories and what the payment rates will be. So what they call non-specialty crops is really, what we call traditional crops here in Kansas. So these include the list that I have here. And I've just highlighted corn, grain, sorghum, and soybeans being the ones in Kansas that most producers would be interested in. Sunflowers is also on that list. You'll notice the one thing that's not on that list is winter wheat. So this did not meet the 5% loss test, which I'm going to show you here in a minute. So these crops had to lose 5% of their value between January 13th through 17th, the average of that week in the futures market, and then the average of the week of the 6th through 9th. That's how they determined if there was a 5% loss, and then that would trigger a payment. So again, winter wheat is not in this situation. So what I have up here is just a table of those prices. So you can see here in this third column over, the average price from the 13th through 17th, and then that compared with the average futures price in the April 6th through 9th, and then that change in the price. So corn lost 63 cents during this time, soybeans 90 cents, and grain sorghum down at the bottom 59 cents. And how grain sorghum was priced was 95% of the corn futures contract. So you can see the change in price and the percent change. Again, they had to at least lose 5% to qualify for the payments. So keep in mind this change here, 63 cents on corn, as I flip over to this next slide, and then I'll show you how they calculated these payment rates. So if you go on farmers.gov/CFAP, CFAP is what the acronym for this program is, you're going to see this table that has two different payment rates. Again, this is two programs wrapped into one payment, and there's different payment rates for these programs. The CARES Act here is paying 50% of that price decline. So going back to my previous slide, you saw on corn, it was a 63-cent loss in futures price between those 2 weeks in January and April. In here, you'll see that corn payment of 32 cents. So that's 50% of that calculated price decline is what the CARES Act payment will be. You'll see here 35 cents. That's 55% of that calculated price decline that the CCC payment will be. And I'll just walk through in a minute how that's actually calculated based on your bushels. But as you can see here, corn, 32 cents in the CARES Act, 35 cents in the CCC. Grain sorghum, where'd it go here? 30 cents in the CARES Act, 32 cents in the CCC, and these are per bushel prices. And then soybeans, 45 cents in the CARES Act, 50 cents in the CCC payment rate. So how is this going to work? So you will get paid based on unpriced inventory as of January 15th, not to exceed 50% of your total production that you had in 2019. And before the chat and the questions start rolling here, just give me a minute to kind of clarify what some of those things mean. First off, we've had some questions on what supporting documentation is needed. And I will say, when you're enrolling for this program, you are self-certifying to these numbers. So you are going to put a number down and self-certify that this is my on-priced inventory as of January 15th, and not to exceed half of your 2019 total production. So you'll be certifying to those two things when you fill out your application form with FSA. Now, this will be subject to spot check. So yes, there's documentation that you will want to have, but you don't have to actually turn that into Farm Service Agency. And looking at the federal regs, this is what they have for examples of supporting documentation. So that can be copies of receipts, ledgers of income, income statements of deposit slips, registered tapes, invoices for custom harvesting, records to verify production costs, contemporaneous measurements, truck scale tickets, or other things determined acceptable by USDA. So there's some ambiguity around this, but if you have good documentation, this should be fairly easy to take care of if you would get spot checked. Now, unpriced inventory is the thing that all of the questions have really boiled down to. And I've put the two definitions up here. The first one is from the federal regulations saying unpriced inventory is any production not subject to an agreed upon price in the future through a forward contract, agreement, or similar binding document. And you can see that second bullet point there is off of the FSA handbook and what that unpriced inventory is defined at. And there was a webinar yesterday for a training for the FSA offices, and this was brought up. And the response was from the national office that, is there still price risk? And, you know, a lot of these questions are surrounding the hedge to arrive contracts, the basis contracts. And I think we will have to wait and see exactly how that that is clarified in the regulations. But right now, all we can say is that if there is still some price risk within that inventory, there's a good chance it would be eligible. So if you are in that situation that you have some of those basis only contracts or hedge arrive or some of those that do have a component of risk in them yet, I would say wait for some clarification on that before you actually go in and enroll with the Farm Service Agency. Now I'm just going to do an example payment here because I showed a lot of tables and price loss, and I just want to make sure I drive home exactly how this payment's going to be calculated. So our loss in corn is 32 cents in the CARES Act, 35 cents in the CCC payment rate. So if a producer had 1,000 bushels of on-price corn in the elevator on January 15th, and that is the key, what is in inventory on January 15th, not to exceed half of your production in 2019. So if it was 10,000 bushels, half of those bushels are going to get the 32-cent rate, and half of those bushels are going to get the 35-cent rate. So when you multiply those out and then add those two together, that's a payment of $3,350 in my example here. Now, the easier way that I think in my mind is to think about this, if you add those payment rates together, that'd be 67 cents per bushel. That's going to be paid on 50% of what your inventory was on January 15th. Now, just to run through that again, here's a soybean example. Again, the CARES Act payment rate was 45 cents per bushel. The CCC payment rate at 50 cents per bushel. So if a producer had 10,000 bushels in on-price inventory on January 15th, then half of that would get the 45-cent rate, half of that would get the 50-cent rate. So that would be a combined payment of $4,750. Now again, the way I like to think about this, add those two rates together, that's 95 cents a bushel, and you're going to be paid on 50% of your inventory on January 15th, assuming that 10,000 bushels is less than 50% of last year's production. Now I'm going to touch on specialty crops because I know we have some people here on that are in the specialty crop category. So with specialty crops, there's 3 different payment rate schedules and 3 different categories for what payment rate you get. The first category is for crops that, like our non-specialty crops, had to meet a 5% test for the loss in price between January 15th and April 15th. And so anything that was sold within that time frame would be subject to that payment rate schedule. Now, the second category would be payments for crops that were shipped, left the farm by April 15th, but spoiled due to the market no longer being available for that product. And a lot of them that went to our retail chains might have fallen in this category. So in this instance, as long as no payment was received for those crops, then they would get the category 2 payment rate. So again, crops that were shipped but spoiled before payment was made on them. The third category is just for crops that did not leave the farm by April 15th. So they might have gotten harvested but were still stored there, didn't have a market, or they weren't harvested but maybe plowed under. And so there's a separate payment rate schedule for that. And I'm obviously not going to go through all of these, but just know this is available on farmers.gov/CFAP. You can see, again, category 1 is the sales between January 15th and April 15th. Category 2 is the ones that left the farm but spoiled before they were marketed and the producer wasn't paid. And then the CCC payment rate are for the unharvested or the harvested ones that never left the farm. Okay, let's jump into livestock here. So for cattle, I'm going to start with cattle. The definition of cattle that's going to be used for these payments means commercially raised or maintained bovine animals, excluding beefalo, bison, and animals used for dairy production or intended for dairy production. So that's a question that I've gotten here. This is beef cattle only, this or dairy animals that are being raised for beef. So any of the dairy production animals do not actually qualify for these payments. So you can see the different categories here. Slaughter cattle, fed cattle lost $267 between January, the futures price, or sorry, the AMS price reported January 13th through 17th compared to April 6th through 10th. And fed cattle is being defined with an average weight in excess of 1,400 pounds, which yield an average carcass weight in excess of 800 pounds and are intended for slaughter. Mature cattle would be the cull cows, raised or maintained for breeding purposes, which were removed from inventory and intended for slaughter. So you can see there, as reported by AMS, the change in price was $114 per head. Feeder cattle less than 600 pounds, losing $127 per head, and then feeder cattle greater than 600 pounds, losing $173 per head in this time frame. So how did this translate into payments? So again, we have two payment rates, like I showed in the non-specialty crops. So how this was calculated, the CARES Act Part 1 payment is for cattle sold between January 15th and April 15th, and that is 80% of the calculated loss that I showed on the previous slide. So that's how they came up with those payment rates. And again, this is cattle that were owned on January 15th and then sold between January 15th and April 15th. And again, the unpriced inventory definition would be applied here. Now, the second category is for the highest inventory of cattle that you have in your ownership between April 16th and 14th, and across the board, that's $33 per head. And while this is not specifically defined in what that $33 a head is going to be paid over, when I went through the cost benefit analysis that was released for this, how they did that was estimating the total loss to the beef industry in quarter 2 and 3 to be $11.3 billion. And then they took that by a factor of 25% and divided it by the July 2019 cattle inventory report, taking out all estimated dairy animals. So the way I understand this is that that $33 per head will be paid over your entire beef inventory, whether that is cows, whether that's the calf by their side, or anything from there until a finished animal. So a lot of questions on that, I know, and reading it, it's not very clear, but looking at the cost benefit analysis, I believe that $33 a head will be paid on all inventory. And they specifically used that July cattle inventory report to account for calves by their mother's side. So yes, the question there, do pairs count as two? I believe they do, the way that I interpret it looking at the cost benefit analysis. So all other cattle in here, you know, this, sorry, there's $102. That's, again, not going to be dairy animals. That would be just applying to the beef herd. So, and Todd, thanks for clarifying there. So pairs count as two head. All right, let's keep moving on here. Hogs and pigs, 120 pounds was used to divide what's considered a pig and what's considered a hog. So again, anything that was sold between January 15th and April 15th, $28 a head for pigs and $18 a head for hogs. Also, same as the cattle, any inventory between April 16th and May 14th will qualify for $17 a head payment. And you know, you get to choose when this is done. So your highest inventory during that time period is what you would get that payment on, just like the cattle. Just a clarification that came in, all other cattle, bred beef cows sold. Yeah, I think that would qualify, or bred heifers or anything like that. Going back to that all other cattle, that's what, in my mind, that category would be for. All right, I know lambs and yearlings, same thing here. Anything that was less than 2 years old will get a $33 per head payment if they were sold between January 15th and April 15th, and then $7 per head payment if they're in inventory from April 16th to May 14th. Wool also is getting a payment, and that's going to be like the non-traditional crops, or sorry, the non-specialty crops, is just going to be paid on the inventory as of January 15th, or 50% of the 2019 production. So there's the CARES payment rate and the CCC payment rate that would be paid just like the non-specialty crops. All right, moving on to dairy. So here, what's going to happen is you will certify your Q1 milk production. So that's your milk production in January, February, and March. And that includes any milk that was dumped. And then multiply that by $4.71 per hundredweight. Now that is for the CARES Act payment, again, that trying to capture the loss in price between January and April. And then going forward, so second quarter production will get $1.47 per hundredweight payment. And Q2, you're not going to certify your Q2 production. They'll just take your Q1 production times a factor of 1.014 to estimate that second quarter production. You'll get that payment all at one time. All right, with that, I'm going to turn it over to the state FSA office to talk about some eligibility and maximum payment rates.
All right, thanks, Robin. My name is Todd Barrows, and I'm with the Kansas Farm Service Agency. I'm a state program specialist here in Manhattan with FSA, and I am going to cover the next few slides that deal with producer eligibility for this program. So as you can see on the slide that is up on the screen, we're talking about who is eligible, or how do we define a producer for this program. And it's the same definition as we use for many of our other FSA programs. It's any person or legal entity, person or legal entity that shares in the risk of producing the crop or livestock. And you have to have risk in that production in order to be entitled to a share of the payment, regardless if it's a crop, specialty crop, dairy, or livestock available for marketing. The thing that's going to be interesting about this program in CFAP is that the applicable year is going to be varied depending on the commodity in which you're applying for a CFAP payment. For example, as Robin's talked about, non-specialty crops, you're looking at who had crop or who had risk or share in that crop for that 2019 production. But when you talk about dairy, specialty crops, and livestock, you're looking at you're looking at that 2019 crop year, or 2020. Could be talking about that 2020 production because of that time frame and when we're looking at that ownership. As far as other eligibility, there is an AGI component with this program. And we have had AGI with our other components, but if you're a livestock producer, you may not have been aware of this. It is a 2020 program year benefit. And so when you're talking about AGI, or adjusted gross income, we're looking at an average of 3 years from your tax returns for 2016, 17, and 18. And just so you're aware that when you complete, it's a CCC 941 consent to release form, where you are certifying your adjusted gross income based on the average of those 3 tax years, 16, 17, 18. That information is sent to IRS for review. Now, there is a special component for those producers that may exceed that 900,000 adjusted gross income threshold. And that is, if your AGI does exceed 900,000 for the 2020 program year, you may still be eligible if you're 75% of that adjusted gross income was derived from farming, ranching, or forestry income. So even though you may exceed, you can still be eligible. And that is a certification. That certification is required to be signed off on by a CPA or a licensed attorney if 75% of your income is derived from farming, ranching, or forestry. So that is a component of AGI. The other thing I want to say is when you're talking about entities and adjusted gross income, we're not only check the entity itself, but AGI also applies to the members of that entity. And we look to the fourth level of ownership. As it's stated there at the bottom of the slide, our HEL wetland conservation regulations do apply to this program as well as they do to all our other programs. Next slide, Rich. You skipped one. There we go. So I want to talk a little bit about payment limitation. For this program, they did determine at the secretary level to increase the payment limitation not to exceed $250,000 for all commodities combined. Normally, payment limitation for most of our programs is $125,000, but for CFAP, they did increase that payment limitation or make that decision, increase it to $250,000 for all commodities combined, and that would be by person or legal entity. Now, again, there is some nuances that are a little bit different under this program than what we've experienced for other programs. And one of those nuances is that if you are a corporate-like entity, in other words, a corporation, a limited liability company, or a limited partnership, you can receive an additional payment limitation up to $750,000 based on contribution of active personal labor and active personal management from the members of that entity, up to 3 members. So in other words, if you have 2 members of your corporate-like entity that certify that they have provided at least 400 hours of active personal labor, active personal management, then you can have up to $500,000 payment limitation. If you have 3 members that can make that certification, then you can have an increase in payment limitation up to $750,000. You will identify on the application for CFAP, and that form number is an AD 3114. There is boxes on that form where you will identify who are the members in that entity if you are a corporate-like entity that is providing that additional active personal labor and active personal management. So you will certify on the form, you can select the members of your entity providing those additional hours. The other thing, this additional limitation only applies, as you notice, to the direct, if that corporate limited liability company and limited partnership is the direct payment entity. If it is a member of a general partnership joint venture, in other words, it's at a second level or embedded entity, then the additional payment limitation does not apply and it's limited at $250,000, just like for all other individuals and entities. But if it is a direct payment entity, then you can have the additional payment limitations if qualifications are met. Another nuance to this additional payment limitation is the spousal rule for providing active personal labor and active personal management does not apply to the additional payment limitation. In other words, in a husband and wife membership under other programs for actively engaged, the husband can qualify the wife by their contribution of active personal labor, active personal management, or vice versa. Under this special provision for increasing payment limitation, that spousal rule does not apply. So the active contribution of 400 hours of labor or management can only qualify the person that's actually doing and making that contribution. And finally, I want to point out on this screen and talk about while the limitations increased to 250,000, 500,000, and 750,000, as we talked about. If you remember up front, one of the first slides that Robin talked about is that payments are limited in the initial go around to 80%. So in reality is what you will see in pocket is that 80% is controlled at the payment limitation level as well. So while we say the payment limit is 250,000, in reality, what you will receive in pocket is 200,000 because 80% of 250 is 200. So instead of 500,000, in reality, it's $400,000 limitation, and the 750,000 payment limit is really an initial payment round is limited to $600,000. Now, if at the end of the program sign up, they determine there's additional funds to make that additional 20% payment, then the payment limitation will be the 250, the 500, and the 750,000. But in this initial go around, it's actually 200,000, 400,000, and 600,000. And finally, I want to visit just a little bit about the forms here in which a producer would need to complete in order to apply for this program. These forms are available online through that farmers.gov/CFAP or CFAP. There is also at that location, there is an online payment calculator that you will be able to use, and you can plug in the numbers for your operation, and you can get an estimated payment of what you will be eligible for. The one thing I would caution you about on using that online payment calculator is I think this is specifically applies to our livestock operators, is if you own, it applies to all commodities, but I think it's most specifically, I want to talk about livestock. But if you own in inventory 50% or a percentage of a livestock herd, you need to do the math and only apply for your percent share of ownership. Again, if you have a percent share ownership in livestock or any other commodity as far as that matter goes, you only should be applying on your percent share of ownership. And you cannot apply on a half of an animal or a third of an animal, so you will have to work out between you and your partners who would get that extra animal if it comes out as a half or a percentage. With that, as I mentioned, the AD 3114 is the CFAP application. That is available online, in which you can complete and fill out and send to your county office or work with your local county office, FSA office in completing. If you have not already participated with FSA programs, you will also need a CCC 902 farm operating plan for your farming operation. That will include who is, if this is an individual, of course, it just includes your name, address, contact information, tax identification number, and your citizenship status, plus with your regarding to your contributions made to that farming operation. If it is an entity, it will not only include the name of the entity, but also the members and the members of the entity's information as far as tax identification numbers, citizenship status, and contributions. When we're talking about contributions, we're talking about as far as land, capital, equipment, management, and active personal labor. While actively engaged is not a requirement for this program, we still need to know your contribution so FSA can determine if you are if your shares are commensurate and at risk for those entities. If you apply online or do the farm operating plan online, the 902, then you do not need to complete the CCC 901. If you do a manual 902, then you also need to do the 901, which again is identifying the members of those entities or those farm and ranch operations, and so that we can record those, and those member information is needed for payment attribution purposes when we make payment. The 941, talked about that a little bit. That's the adjusted gross income, consent to release. That's where you're certifying whether or not you met or exceeded that $900,000 threshold. Keep in mind those will be sent to IRS for review. And if it's determined that you do exceed, or if you certify that you exceed that $900,000 threshold, then you can also complete the 942, and that takes the certification of a CPA or an attorney, and it must be a licensed CPA in order to determine if 75% of your income comes from farming, ranching, and forestry. You can still be eligible for this program. The AD 1026 form is the highly erodible land conservation, wetland conservation form. It's been around since the 85 Farm Bill. It's pretty straightforward, just to whether or not you are applying conservation compliance measures in your farming operation. The AD 2047 is a form that just gives us your basic customer information so that we can load you into our database as far as name, address, contact information, tax identification numbers, etc. And then, of course, the 3881, that is the we request all producers to provide a 3881 for direct deposit for payments. I will note that if it will create a hardship for you to have a direct deposit, there are ways that we can cut a check through the Treasury, but that does take some additional identification or documentation as far as that hardship, and you will need to work with your local FSA county office if that is your situation. With that, at this point, I think I will turn it over to our State Executive Director, David Schemm. I believe he is on the line, and he wants to talk a little bit about county office operations and how our local FSA offices are going to be handling the workflow. As most of you are aware, if not, with the COVID-19 situation that is across our state, at this point in time, we do have limited access as far as our offices being open for face-to-face contact with producers. However, our employees and our field offices are there. They are working. And you can contact the county offices either by phone, through email, and also we are putting into place software available to where we can communicate directly with producers through appointment, be a Teams meeting, which you can do an online face-to-face meeting. You can also pass documents via email, or also pass documents versus a Dropbox. And you will need to contact your local county office by phone, and then they can set up a time for you to handle your enrollment into this program. David, did you get on?
I did. I think I got unmuted.
All right.
So thank you, Todd. All right. Thank you. And good morning, everybody. Sorry about that. Trying to get the phone figured out. My computer, my connectivity out here is somewhat limited. I've been able to get on Zoom, but I joined with audio by phone. So we were trying to get that figured out. First of all, I want to give just a shout out to both Robin and Rich, and very much appreciate being able to be a part of this and provide comments and hopefully clarification on that. And like Robin said, our offices across the state did receive their training just yesterday afternoon. And of course, had a lot of questions, and we've been working with questions and working with the national office to try to make sure that we get those questions answered for that. And so have definitely been seeing a lot of questions from everybody coming in here, and some great questions. And I think we'll be able to help address a lot of those. And absolutely, Rich, we will help supply or give answers as we know best if we're able to pull together all those questions there. Just a couple of brief comments I want to make. And as Robin alluded to on this, it is right now 80% of the funding as this was directed, and as she alluded to, this was directed by OMB, the Office of Management and Budget. You know, obviously with PPP, some of the funding let out. So these were steps taken here to make sure that the funding does not run out for the first 80% of this program. The sign-up period, again, starts 5/26. This is when the online tool will become active there. Encourage producers definitely to take a look at that. There'll be a great starting point for all of you. The sign-up deadline date is August 28th. So within that, what I definitely want to encourage everybody to realize or remember that because of the setup of the 80%, that we don't see funding running out for the program here for the 80%. So there's no necessary for you to rush into offices for fear of funding run out. Again, we know a lot of impact for all of you out there to be able to definitely utilize this program. So we encourage you to get in there. Just a brief comment on it. Like Robin said, this program was established to aid those commodities that had a 5% or greater national price loss. There is an opening, and it will be opening up shortly here at farmers.gov, a period of comments for what is called a NOFA. And so what a NOFA is a notice of funding availability. And so there's going to be a comment available for producers and organizations to comment in there if they believe that their commodity was left out but was exposed to a 5% or greater national price loss during that period of mid-January to mid-April. There is already some discussions concerning some various commodities that may have experienced a loss, and I know comments will be on that. And then just last of all that I wanted to briefly mention, like Todd was saying, is that obviously with the current situation surrounding COVID-19, it's made it pretty challenging and dynamic for all of our offices out there to continue to help producers across the state here. Unfortunately, we're having to do it by phone or email to be able to help all of you out there. And I can assure you this much, our offices are eager to get producers back in there just as eagerly as I know many of you are wanting to get into the office there and talk and work with them. But we're absolutely doing the best we can to help everybody within the conditions we are. We're working with getting some personal protective equipment and some additional clarifications to be able to get our offices open back up And quite honestly, I expect it to be within probably weeks, if not days, that we should be able to at least allow some limited customer interaction there. So I know we're all looking forward to that, to be able to help better service you all. But in the meantime, please don't hesitate to reach out, give a phone call to that office, drop an email to them, and they will definitely help you as best as they can. That is all I have. And with that, I will turn it back over to Robin, I believe.
All right. Thank you, David. I'm going to try to go through some of the chat questions here. I see there's a lot of them and we may not get them all to them today, but it looks like my department head volunteered us to make a question and answer document of them. So I guess we'll be working on that when we can here. Todd and David and Carla, if you want to unmute or turn your cameras on or both, some of these I'm definitely going to defer to you. A question that a lot of the chat questions surrounding silage. Todd, do you know, or Carla, if silage would qualify, that is in inventory on January 15th?
Robin, corn silage does qualify for this program if on inventory, and it's still subject to price risk. So
Okay.
yes, silage would be eligible. We will convert it to a grain basis.
Okay, thank you. And another common question here, I went through on the definition of cattle that it didn't include dairy animals, but there's been some, I maybe misspoke on that. Have you gotten clarification on those cull dairy cows and if they would qualify for a cattle payment?
The cull dairy cattle will qualify if there's, if they are a dairy animal being fed for market, then they will qualify for the payment entity, or they will qualify for a payment.
So cull dairy cows that were sold between January 15th and April 15th, do they get the mature cow slaughter payment?
We may need to check on qualify on that one. I do know that we have got they did clarify yesterday on the national call, when you have a dairy animal in a feedlot situation, then they are eligible. But on the cull dairy cow, we'll need to get further clarification.
Okay, thank you. Some other ones here. So some questions around the cow-calf producer receiving the payment and, you know, what's considered all cows and calves in inventory. Again, I'll try to clear that up a little bit. I know I was stuttering around that a little bit. So the cow and the calf both qualify for that, that payment. Let me zip back to that actually. So that $33 payment applies to all classes of livestock that were your highest inventory between April 16th and May 14th, and that all other cattle would include any your bred heifers or anything like that. So if those were sold between January 15th and April 15th, all other cattle would get that $102 per head payment. So that's all cattle that don't fit in those other categories. And again, you would have to have owned those on January 15th, though. They couldn't have been purchased and sold within that time frame.
Yeah, and Robin, if I could jump in there just to make sure everybody's very clear that on the inventory of the cow-calf between those dates, April 16th and May the 15th, you got the mature cattle, or the cow will receive the $33 payment under that mature cattle category. And then the unweaned calf on the side will also receive the $33 payment as a feeder calf less than 600 pounds. And that's how it'll be entered into the system.
Okay, thank you. Question on seed corn. Will that be considered inventory under specialty crops or non-specialty crops? I can say it's not listed under non-specialty, or sorry, specialty. So will that corn seed be counted as corn inventory?
I cannot, we will have to get clarification on that as well. I cannot answer that question.
Okay. And then a clarification here, so you only get paid on 50% of your inventory. Let me just zip back to that example here. So you get paid these two payment rates, and one payment rate is on half of your inventory on January 15th, so 32 cents on half of your inventory, 35 cents on the other half of your inventory. So the way I think about it is adding those two payment rates together and paying on 50% of your inventory. It comes out the same either way. Just know there's two payment rates, and 100% of your inventory is being paid on as of January 15th, but half of the inventory gets one payment rate and half gets the other. And Todd, if you see any other questions in here you want to jump in and talk to, I'm just trying to hit the ones that have been asked more than once.
There's a question here that do corn hay bales count as inventory? If corn hay bales would count as inventory. Also, I do know the question has came up also on dual purpose sorghum. That will also count as inventory as grain sorghum. And again, we will convert those hay bales. There is a conversion factor that will convert those back to a grain basis. Same as, just like the silage, as long as they're still subject to price risk.
Okay. The question here, does the price that you actually sold your cattle at hogs at make a difference? No, it doesn't. So that loss was computed at a national level, and you just get paid a per animal rate for the animals that were sold between January 15th and April 15th. And so related question, if your cattle were sold on mid-March, but not slaughtered until later, you back me up, Todd, if I'm wrong in this, but as long as they were sold on that March date and you didn't have ownership of them anymore, they should qualify for payment.
That's right. It's not the date of delivery, it's the date of sale.
And along with that question, 1,300 pound fed heifers that don't quite make that 1,400 definition, which one would they fall under?
The way it was presented, and I have not seen the handbook yet, one CFAP, it was supposed to be out later today or Tuesday morning, but the way they presented it to us on our national training yesterday, that it is a 1,400 pound average, and it will be clarified in the handbook and so it's a range between 1,200 pounds and 1,600 pounds. So if they meet that range, then we believe they will qualify as a fed slaughter, but it's an average of 1,400 pounds as a target. So it's between that 1,200 pound and 1,600 pound range is the way we understand it. Will be clarified in the actual handbook when it comes out.
Okay, thank you. Question, I think you got that one already, Todd. If feeder cattle were on hand after April 15th and you still have them today, do they count for the payment? Yes, it's the $33 payment for your highest inventory between April 16th and May 14th, regardless if you still have them now or not. I think I'm getting through most of the big ones here. Todd, do you see any more? Some of the technical ones, I'm going to defer to you there.
No, one that I saw here is saying, can we discuss the definition of inventory more? What if it's in inventory contracted but not picked up? What if it's in inventory but has an HTA or basis contract? And what about unpriced commodities and pools? So again, I'm going to go back to, and we've hit on this a little bit. If it is still subject to price risk, then it is counted as in inventory. Now, if you have sold the commodity and it just hasn't been picked up, in other words, the price has been locked in, but you got a future delivery point, then that is considered sold and is no longer in inventory. We have discussed basis contracts, and basis contracts, again, it goes back to, is that in price is there still price risk? And as I understand a basis contract, yes, there still is a price risk in that basis contract. So it would still qualify as inventory. Unpriced commodity pool, again, if you have not received a definite price, so in other words, if it's still subject to a price risk, then it would be qualified as inventory. So that's the thing that you got to ask yourself. Do you still have price risk?
Thank you, Todd. Question here, will payments begin as soon as approved or after the August deadline? They will begin as soon as approved. Is that right?
That is correct. Payment software will be in place at the time of sign up, and within the first week, you should be starting to see payments roll out.
Okay.
When your application is approved.
Does the silage need to be corn silage?
It could also, it doesn't have to be corn silage. It has to, but keep in mind your non-specialty crops. That would be the most common one, but I do know some producers would put up other types of silage, but it has to be a non-specialty crop that we talked about.
So someone that sold cattle or calves on January 14th. I feel like I talked to producers in that same boat yesterday, and unfortunately, I don't think there's anything we can do there. I think January 15th was a date that was chosen as that's when the market began to get impacted by the COVID situation, and the major drop occurred between that week in January and the mid-April week. Do you have any other comments on your national office from that, Todd?
No, that will be a hard, fast date. I don't suspect that will change.
Okay. What about alfalfa? I don't think there's any payment there.
Right.
I guess if there's a case like David mentioned, there's the NOFA that has some money and could be submitted to that. Oh, they keep coming, Todd.
They do.
We're approaching an hour now. I know we lost a lot of people already, so why don't we hit a few more and then we'll try to get the rest later on. One thing I've seen repeated here a little bit, so these payments were really to address the losses that happened, quarter one, quarter two. So the 2020 crops really aren't targeted when I'm talking about non-specialty crops and cattle here. The 2020 crops aren't really in there. As far as cattle, right. It's your inventory now that you're going to sell in quarter 2 and 3. There is a possibility that there will be more payments coming depending on how this situation plays out for the rest of the year as far as this year's production.
A question that came up, and this came up on the national call, farm store grain, will that qualify if not priced? Yes. Farm store grain does count as inventory if it's not priced.
If someone sold a group of feeder cattle that averaged 600 but ranged between 450 and 800, do they divide those animals up to get the different payment rate for less than 600 and more than 600, or is that just paid over the average?
It's paid based on the average.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Trucking costs would not be still at price risk, I do not believe.
And David got the one there on the catfish. Yeah, it's, cut flowers and aquaculture are the ones they're really targeting there under the NOFA,
and that's yet, they are looking at that, but yes, that's still yet to be determined for sure. Yep, but they are looking at aquaculture. Yep, and cut flowers.
The payment limit is not related to ARC and PLC or other programs. This is a separate payment rate. So I think we've seen that question a couple times too here.
Yes, that is correct. As well as the AGI, when you exceed the 900,000, that is only applicable to this program. It is not applicable to ARC PLC.
I'm going to zip over to specialty crops just to hit one question here. And then Todd, I think pick one more and then we'll wrap it up because I know we've been kind of long on an hour here. So in these specialty crops, some documentation, so column 2 and 3 again are for stuff that left the farm that spoiled, and then stuff that never did leave the farm. I think I got my definitions on this previous slide here. So the ones that spoiled due to no market, you must obtain documentation such as a letter from the buyer explaining no payment or other record validating that there wasn't any payment made for those crops. And then the ones that are still on the farm, you're going to have to certify, like I defined in the non-specialty crops, of your inventory, production records, things like that.
There, Robin, there's a question here that I'll just end on, and that is, husband and wife LLC limit is $250,000, and that is correct. It's $250,000, but remember there is a exception, and that is if both the husband and the wife can actually certify that they each, and I want to emphasize each, contributed over 400 hours of active personal labor and or active personal management, then they can make a certification on the 80-3114 form, and they can increase their payment limitation to that 500,000 level. But they would both have to be able to make that certification of 400,000 or 400 hours of active personal labor management.
All right, and let's end. We've had a couple questions on cotton here. Todd, do you have some clarification on what cotton that actually applies to?
I believe it only applies to, I want to say, I should have that, ELS cotton or extra long, it only applies to upland cotton.
Okay.
So if it qualifies for upland cotton, same as like our ARC PLC contracts and et cetera, then it applies for this program. It only applies to upland cotton.
Okay, I think with that, we are going to go ahead and wrap up for today. I've been saving all the questions I'm getting via email, and I will look through these questions via chat and try to put those together and send them out, post them on our website as well. It probably won't happen before the weekend here, but we will try to get that information out as soon as possible. Just thank you to David and Todd and Carla for being on today and helping. I know this information's been highly sought after for months, so we just want to try to get all the information out there we can. Know that sign up starts next Tuesday, but just be gracious with your local FSA office because they are brand new working through this as well. Any last comments, Todd or David or Carla?
Robin, I would just want to just shout out to thank you for your team and Rich Llewellyn for allowing FSA to be part of this call, and for your leadership and guidance and putting this slide presentation together. And very much appreciated to team up with us and allow us to be a partner on this.
Thank you, Todd.
Yep, I would echo Todd's comments, and hopefully this has been helpful for everyone.
All right, thank you, David. And with that, everybody have a good Memorial Day weekend. Stay safe and watch for our website and our email, and we'll be getting more information out to you as we get it put together. Have a good day.